60 years ago, Botswana was the second poorest country in the world. Today, it's one of Africa's richest, safest, and most stable democracies. A landlocked dry country smaller than the US state of Texas now beats giants like Nigeria and Egypt in living standards, with Africa's highest literacy rates and one of its lowest corruption scores. Botswana is often termed the Singapore of Africa. Now, how this country has been able to achieve such remarkable success in such a short time has been the subject of many discussions. However, this isn't a story about its diamonds, because if resources alone made nations rich, then the Congo would be a paradise. Well, it's not. So what did Botswana do so differently? And why do many economists say there will never be another Botswana? Botswana has been prehistorically occupied by a people called the Tswana. That's where the name came from. Bo meaning land and Tswana, the people. Long before independence, Botswana was shaped by a political culture unlike most of Africa. The Tswana people practiced a system known as the Gotla, an open system where laws and disputes were debated publicly, and the chief, or the Gozi, was expected to listen. This tradition of consultation and accountability stood in stark contrast to the absolute monarchies that dominated much of the continent. You see, Botswana as a country almost never happened, and to understand why, we need to look at its geography. Botswana is a semi-arid plateau, sparsely populated and landlocked, but surrounded by powerful and aggressive neighbors. To the south, apartheid South Africa, and to the north was Sir Seretse Rhodesia, all infamous for conquering territory through brutal military expansion. And not to mention the French also circling around, hoping to extend their own sphere of influence. It was because of these dangers that the Botswana Gozi asked the British for protection, that is, to become a protectorate. But due to the perceived lack of value compared to agriculturally rich colonies in West Africa like Ghana and Nigeria, or gold-rich South Africa, the British simply ignored Botswana's request and simply just carried on. But they would later have to accept because of three reasons. First was to checkmate Sir Seretse's ambitions in Southern Africa. Second, the British needed a buffer zone to prevent the breaking out of another costly conflict like the Anglo-Boer War of 1899. And third was the continuous pressure of the three Dikosi. That's the three Botswana chiefs, Khama, Sabele, and Batoen. They were so persistent that in 1895, they sailed all the way to England to petition Queen Victoria against being annexed by Sir Seretse's military machine. And it worked. The arrangement allowed Britain to secure influence over Southern Africa with little to no cost. The tribal system here was so trusted and stable that Botswana under the British kind of operated like an independent country. That single quality of being perceived as valueless would change Botswana history forever, as Botswana was treated as a piece of real estate rather than a colony from whom to extract wealth. Things would basically remain the same until 1966 when it gained independence under one Sir Seretse Khama. Khama was the heir to the chiefdom of Bangwato, one of the largest tribes in Botswana. He was a promising young man who had gone to London to study law. He fell in love and then everything fell. You see, while Khama was studying in London, he got involved and married to a British woman, a black tribal chief, married to a white woman. And all this happening just at the border of apartheid South Africa in the 1950s. This marriage was more than a union between two lovers. This would be the cause of one of the greatest political storms in Botswana history. The South African Republic placed so much pressure on the British to intervene. The British Parliament, fearing losing its economic interests in South Africa, chose to comply, and for the first time, it intervened and stepped on Botswana's sovereignty. They declared Khama unsuitable to rule, despite local courts asserting his royal status. They said it was thanks to his, quote, and I'm not kidding, unfortunate marriage choice. He was eventually banished from Botswana, himself and his wife, in 1951. However, after much international pressure, he was only allowed to return in 1956 after he had renounced his claim to chieftaincy. But as fortune would have it, Seretse Khama was destined to be much more than a tribal chief. Upon his return to Botswana in 1956, then the Botswana land, He founded the Botswana Democratic Party and then successfully led the Bechuanaland to independence in 1966 as Prime Minister of the new Republic of Botswana. The same year, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth. However, this is not the fairy tale ending you imagine. You see, Sir Seretse Khama was now at the helm of a newly independent nation, the second poorest in the world. The nation had almost no prospects for growth and development. Botswana had a total of 12 kilometers of paved road, and the number of citizens with a university degree was 22. No, just 22. Almost all of its citizens were illiterate, and the nation ranked amongst the poorest in the world by GDP per capita basis. The newly independent government was reliant on British aid for nearly half of its budget, so it's safe to say that things were pretty messed up. And as bad as things seem to be, it would only get worse. Much of colonial Africa turned to nationalism in this period of early statecraft. Some states were able to make considerable progress, though often at the expense of human rights, democracy, or the rule of law. Khama's approach, on the other hand, avoided radical ideology. He believed that Botswana's citizens should enjoy increases in standard of living without losing basic civil and political liberties. But despite Khama's strong ideals, the Botswana economy was dominated by livestock production. Livestock products accounted for more than 90% of exports, and cattle outnumbered humans about 3 to 1. As the nation's primary economic activity, livestock production was not particularly profitable or effective, because in a country that is 70% semi-arid desert, drought conditions and insufficient water would always pose real challenges to the sector, and at multiple points in the 1960s, Botswana was reliant on famine relief aid to feed its citizens. It's safe to say that the future looked very dim for the young republic, but its visionary leadership wasn't ready to give up. To begin expanding the economy beyond its reliance on livestock and towards Botswana's diverse mineral resources, the leadership borrowed heavily from abroad. With this, they bought the tools needed to set up small-scale mining operations in Botswana. And while Botswana's early leaders adopted some free market policies, they recognized the dangers of depending on the IMF and World Bank too heavily, and thus ensured to keep them at arm's length. As Botswana's development began, it once again found itself in an unusually practical arrangement to solve a post-colonial issue: the lack of skilled administrators to run the government. Since there were barely a few hundred formally educated local citizens, Khama had former British administrators from the colonial period to continue serving in government until enough qualified Botswana citizens would rise to feel the responsibility. This sense of pragmatism would further extend to Khama's foreign affairs, as he chose to adopt a policy of non-alignment, choosing to distinguish Botswana from its surrounding regimes without antagonizing them. Since other countries in the region had vast deposits of diamond reserves, Sir Seretse Khama had good reasons to begin the search for diamonds in Botswana. However, many other oil, mineral, and diamond-rich nations had begun to politically collapse and backslide towards corruption and authoritarianism. This resource curse was exemplified by Nigeria, the Congo, and the Central African Republic, which suffered despite and if not due to oil and diamond reserves respectively. This, of course, served as a cautionary tale for Botswana. Seretse Khama organized a unique approach to diamonds in Botswana by striking a deal with the Tswana leaders. Since diamond could potentially be discovered in some regions but not the others, the clan leaders agreed beforehand to a resource-sharing agreement that disregarded domestic territorial claims. This would prevent any geographical lucky clans from hoarding the nation's wealth, and this would ensure that all regions in Botswana reaped the benefits of future diamond mining. Khama struck this deal despite having known that his clan's territory was diamond rich. He put his clan's interest aside in the name of the good of the entire country. You see, Sir Seretse Khama's vision agreement was so timely, as fortune was about to smile on Botswana, because just 1 year after its independence from the British, the South African mining giant, De Beers, discovered diamond, and lots of it, in this small town, Orapa, in central Botswana. And by 1972, Botswana discovered another, by far the world's most valuable diamond mine in the famous Draneng. How Botswana handled its resource extraction is one of the reasons Botswana is so rich today. In 1971, the government of Botswana set up a joint venture with De Beers. They called it Tswana. The arrangement included a 50-50 ownership and profit sharing. Apart from this, the government also collects royalty of 10% on all diamond exports. And on top of all that, the government imposes revenue taxes on the companies, which is usually something between 22 to 25%. Well, I know that's a lot of paper numbers, so how about we draw a real life scenario? Assuming the company Tswana made $2 billion in 2026. First of all, 10% is immediately received by the Botswana government. That is $200 million. Now let's call operating costs, including fuel, salaries, and machines, $800 million. So we are left with $1 billion. That $1 billion is then taxed. You know the standard corporate tax in Botswana is 22%, so 22% of 1 billion. That's another $220 million to the government's coffers. The remaining $780 million is then shared based on the agreed 50-50 rate, which is $390 million. In total, the government made $810 million. That's 81% of the profit. About 20% going to De Beers and the remaining 40% going to operational costs. Now, I believe you get the point. Botswana makes a lot from its mineral extraction. But what does it do with all this cash? Botswana invested its revenue in infrastructure, in its health sector, in its public sector, and most especially in its people. In Botswana, education is free or some parts heavily subsidized all the way to university level. This of course led to a huge jump in literacy rates from 20% to 90% in just 6 decades. As of independence, Botswana had a per capita GDP of $75. In contrast, Nigeria's was $200 and Ghana's was $250. Today, Botswana has surpassed both Nigeria and Ghana in all life and economic standards except the gross domestic product. Botswana went from having an HDI Human Development Index score of around 0.3 in 1966, one of the lowest in the world, to 0.73, one of the highest in Africa. But then, what makes Botswana's success so difficult to replicate in other African countries? You see, what made Botswana so successful is going to be extremely hard to replicate, as the exact combination of factors it had going for it basically just doesn't exist anywhere else in the world today. It begins at the roots. As I've said, the Tswana are a very unique kingdom who never really experienced the whims and caprices of an absolute monarchy or even build a culture around it. They had a prehistoric culture that included some form of democracy, unlike other African kingdoms. And when the British came around, they didn't exploit Botswana as much as they did their colonies in Nigeria, Madagascar, Kenya, or Ghana. In fact, Botswana was never really a British colony. It was a protectorate, which meant limited intervention in local politics. But these alone aren't sufficient enough reasons for Botswana's success, as there are African countries that had local systems preserved, or even some weren't even colonized at all, e.g. Ethiopia, which is still, well, pretty much a very poor country. So how did Botswana get so rich? You see, Botswana is one of the most homogeneous countries in the world, with around 80% being ethnic Tswanas. This led to reduced ethnic tensions, which of course meant less, or in Botswana's case, 0 civil wars. But then, when you look at Somalia, which is more homogeneous than Botswana is, but has had far more civil wars and is basically a failed state, you realize that this isn't it. So what really made Botswana rich? Now this question would lead me down a rabbit hole that I would explore for days. After going through multiple publications, research pieces, I finally found the answer in this book written by Nobel Prize winning economists Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, Why Nations Fail. They said, what makes a country rich or poor is the presence of strong, equitable and effective institutions, or the lack thereof. And Botswana absolutely nailed that. Botswana is one of the least corrupt African countries according to Transparency International and one of the most institutionally stable in the world. Its first president, Sir Seretse Khama, was a visionary leader who, rather than focus on ideological principles, Khama's policies focused on solving real issues with practical, not ideological solutions. And this still guides Botswana's foreign policy even till today. And now, I cannot say Botswana is perfect. In fact, it's far from that. Economic growth has slowed and even reversed over the years with decreased global demand for diamond. Botswana's youth unemployment rate is skyrocketing. The over-reliance on diamonds is taking a huge strain on the economy, and Botswana's HIV/AIDS crisis remains one of the worst in the world, with about 21% of adults between the ages of 15 and 64 living with HIV/AIDS. With all these problems looming over Botswana, it's unclear whether Botswana's economic and political legacy will continue or begin to collapse like its neighbors, as the nation owes much of its prosperity today to the shrewd and pragmatic governance of its early leaders. So today's question remains, will the strong leadership that brought the nation this far live on, or will Botswana's economic and political challenges prove too great and crack Africa's brightest gem? However, Botswana isn't the only resource-rich country. There is another one like it. But unlike Botswana's economic miracle, the resources have sponsored numerous wars, armed conflicts, militias, warlords, and seditious foreign actors. I'm talking about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC for short. We actually made a short explainer video detailing the tragic experiment that broke the Congo. You can go ahead to click the video right now. Otherwise, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.